get into the warm season annuals than we have in some of the cool seasons. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Ray. And I don't see a clock, so keep me on time if you would, Ray. Give me a 5-minute warning. Perfect. So we'll talk about two things in this session this morning, actually. We will talk about seed quality, but also Ray had a term on there, something about industry priorities, and we didn't really flesh that out a lot, so it was open to my interpretation, I guess. So somebody asked about brachytic dwarf. We'll talk about some of those things, other traits, if you will, that the warm season industry is working on to bring to producers. So to start with, when it comes to seed quality, it all comes down to you county agents or you guys on the farm. It all comes down to that seed tag that comes on every bag of seeds, sorghum, grass, alfalfa, any kind of seed. I'll probably say it a couple of times today, but the best guidance you can give your producers is if they buy any kind of seed and plant it, save at least one of those tags. So I'll say that again later. But when it comes to sorghum, as far as certification standards for certified seed, these are the rules for Kentucky anyway. So the purity has to be at least 98% of sorghum, sorghum sudan, sudan grass, whichever. Got a little typo though. It's other crops, period, not just other than ryegrass. So 0.08%. We're not. This is biology. This is agriculture. We can't do 100% purity in reality. Every 100-acre field is going to have a weed or a wheat or something in it somewhere. So we just got to work on reasonable tolerances. And in sorghums, this is what has been decided is the reasonable tolerance. Other crops, which may be any other crop type that we would grow, you can have 0.08%. Other varieties in seed production, I was just in Texas a few weeks ago, pretty much all of these warm season annuals are produced in a fairly small geography, probably a 2-hour radius in Texas. So if a farmer, seed farmer's planting variety A this year, he probably had variety XYZ a couple years in the past. So it's pretty easy to get cross-contamination. Yeah, that's a sorghum sudan, but it's not the one we want. We'll look at a picture of that here in a second. So all of this stuff is pretty regulated. This is one to pay attention. For certified seed, again, to have that blue certified tag, they don't allow any of the noxious weeds in sorghums or sorghum sudans. Weed seed, again, this is biology, this is agriculture. We can't be 100% pure, so we get a little allowance of 0.1%. And germination, 80% germination. We try to do better than that as an industry, but that is the limit, and that's fairly low, in my opinion. So as far as practically how this works, we as an industry have two opportunities to clean up problems in seed production. You guys have probably seen pictures, or maybe you've toured seed cleaning plants. There's all these various gizmos that separate out seed by size, by weight, by color, all kinds of stuff. So if we harvest a problem, we can sort it out a little bit. But the best way to do it is here. Any weed control or purity control we can do in the field is a lot cheaper, a lot more effective than when we're running it through machinery. So a couple weeks ago I was down by Amarillo, and here's a field of, this is forage sorghum actually, and somebody mentioned brachytic dwarf. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. This is a dwarf, so we're looking for little short guys. But lo and behold, there's that thing. That's not the variety we want. So I didn't get a picture of them, but there are several guys who their lot in life is to walk through these fields with a hoe and get rid of those things. They do every field several times a year. So that is one control mechanism. Now, what's this stuff in the background? Got nice little dwarf sorghum here. What's that? Corn. So that's an isolation mechanism for them. That's another thing that was not on my slide. I think by regulation you have to have 1,000 feet, 1,200 feet, something like that between different varieties. That's to somewhat reduce pollen flow between varieties. Companies, though, this particular company, their internal standard is they want 2 miles between fields to make sure they don't have drift of pollen, and they always plant their fields surrounded by really, really tall corn. So we take a lot of steps as an industry to try to keep these genetics pure. You know, Ray talked about how much work goes into making a hybrid, especially with some of these traits. When we do that, we want to make sure and keep it pure. So
Chad, when
yeah.
I see, normally when we plant a rachitic dwarf, there's always a few tall plants in there.
Yeah.
Those are actual different varieties.
Good question, Chris, and I guess I better repeat it for here. So the question was, every time we plant a dwarf, there's some tall plants in there. If anyone's ever driven through Kansas or Nebraska where they do milo, which is grain sorghum, they're all these little short guys, but every so often there's something tall. It's about 1 in 1,000, and that is one of Ray's genetic mutations. Spontaneous mutation happens, and it loses that trait and it goes back to the wild type and gets tall. So it's going to happen anyway in a field. 10, 20 acre field, you're going to see some that have just spontaneously mutated and gotten tall. Good question, Chris.
But Chad,
yeah.
But those plants are genetically the same, aren't they? They're just mutated different. They have the same genes.
So they had the same genes. That they were probably the right hybrid. The two same inbreds came together. It's just that particular gene that makes it dwarf got mutated. It's probably still BMR, for instance, if those parents were BMR. And contamination does happen too. Well, one good way to see that in the sorghums anyhow, there's different colors. There's white-seeded, red-seeded. So if you have a white-seeded variety and you see something red, that is contamination. I will. Yeah. Okay. So, again, that little seed tag that we all see on those bags, that comes from an AOSA seed exam. It's an official regulated process. And in sorghums anyhow, that sample's 500 grams, so a pound. Noxious weeds, when they're sorting through seed by seed looking for thistles or shattercane or whatever they're looking for, they look through 500 grams. But if you think about it, that 500 gram sample that I could nearly hold in my hands represents 100,000 pounds of seed, which would halfway fill up this room. So seed sampling, just like forage sampling, is key. And then it's a regulated process. There are state people generally who do that to make sure that you don't just poke one bag and say that represents this giant mountain of seed. But still, if you just think about that, what are the odds that some little weed seed is going to sneak by if I got half a room full of seed and I boil it down to this much? So again, we're dealing with biology. Things happen. We just try to keep those tolerances somewhat reasonable. Does that make sense? Okay, so here we go. Here's this analysis tag. And if you know what you're looking for, there's a whole bunch of information on this thing. And this is just something I made up, but every bag of seed that goes through commerce by law is supposed to have one of these things attached to it. So again, have your producers, or if you are a producer, save one of these tags. If you come to me with a problem and you can produce this tag, I can trace it back, isolate the problem, find everybody else who may have the same seed and has the same problem. So it really helps us solve problems if we have this seed tag. So here's just something I made up, Sweet Treat brand Sudan grass. I'll talk about brands in a second. And it is made up of two components, actually. Here's some long, hairy named variety, and then variety unknown. Other states it's called VNS. So we don't know what that variety is, but it all gets put in this brand name. Other crop, 1%. Now, just a few minutes ago, I said for certified seed, you could only have like 0.1%. So this seed probably isn't good enough to be certified. In fact, it's not. Weed seed, technically there's 0 when they sorted through their sample. So by weight, by percentage, it's 0. However, in this case, they found a giant foxtail. And if they found one, you do the math, it translates to 9 of those per pound. Again, certified standards said you couldn't have any noxious weeds, but here it is on this label. So this is uncertified seed. It is legal to sell, It just wouldn't make certified standards. And interestingly, every state has their own little rules about what they consider noxious weeds, and it's different in Washington, where I live, than here in Kentucky. And Kentucky generally has really, really good seed laws, good for you as consumers, really good protection. However, giant foxtail, everybody know what that is? Everybody's favorite plant? Legally, I can have 192 of those per pound and still sell the seed in Kentucky. Now, I have to tell you that on this seed tag. So again, working with your producers, read that thing. Read that tag. Because, you know, if you think about our society, we're a buyer beware society. I can sell you anything as long as I tell you what I'm doing within some limits. So just because you see seed on the shelf doesn't mean that it meets those really stringent certification standards.
Would all noxious weeds be listed that they found? Like if there was...
In Kentucky, yes. So again, every state is different. And if you go to the USDA website, I should have made a link, Ray. You can get this 150-page booklet where there's a federal part of it. You know, Canada thistle is pretty much noxious everywhere. That's a federal decision. But then each state makes up their own. Some states, I only have to list what the noxious weeds are if they are over a certain threshold. In Kentucky, just the way that your rules are here, every single noxious weed, I have to list what it is. Now, lamb's quarters, not a noxious weed. So that would show up here as a percentage, but you wouldn't know which weed it was. It's only the things we deem noxious that I have to actually label it.
Noxious seeds, a federal listing, or do they vary?
There is a federal listing of noxious weeds, and it's fairly short. Then each state has a board that determines what their issues are. Annual bluegrass, for instance, Poa annua. Whoever makes that list in Kentucky has deemed that that is a noxious weed for you folks. Half the country doesn't worry about it at all. So there are various regional differences here. And sometimes weeds float on and off of this list. You know, 20 years ago, the lists weren't what they are today. There's always a new weed popping up. But those things move slow. So there's probably weeds that are really a problem on some of the farms you work with that they just haven't deemed noxious yet. Another thing on here, and this is more from our industry point of view, I have to label where that seed comes from. If you want to buy American made, you can. If the seed comes from Guatemala or something, I have to tell you that. This thing, AMS, that's a Ag Marketing Service number. So given this number, I could go back to the exact facility where this stuff came from. So if there was a weed issue or a germination problem or something, I would be able to narrow it down to that facility. Lot number narrows it down even more specifically. In sorghums, at least, that lot size is 100,000 pounds. So there's only however many bags that is, 50-pound bags, of that lot number. So if you have a problem with lot number L68-1 PhD 22, I can find every other producer that received that lot number and see if they had the same problems as well. So again, that's a long way of saying seed tags are extremely, extremely important. So we'll talk about this just for a minute. And I think this made such an impression on me because before I got in the industry, I had no idea about brands and varieties, or in this case hybrids, I guess, for most of our sorghums. So a variety or a hybrid, if this is hybrid XYZ, that's a genetic term. That's genetically defined. It means something. It's been classified. It's been officially documented. A brand is a trade name. So I have a trademark thing with the PTO, Patent and Trademark Office. That really describes the packaging, the logos, colors, all that kind of stuff. So it describes the bag, actually, at the end of the day. I could stuff whatever I want inside of that bag, and it's still my brand. So from a marketing point of view, the industry likes brands because it's consistent. There's new hybrids coming out every year, and you as producers would have to keep track of all this stuff. We as a company can say, we're going to find the best stuff we can, and always put it in our Sweet Treat brand or whatever the brand name is, so that that's the name producers identify with. And that works if that's what you do. I could also say, I'm going to find the cheapest junk I can find and put it in this nice fancy bag as well. So it comes down to this. When it comes to buying seed, work with companies you trust, work with companies with a long, good reputation, and go on local performance. If everybody, one of your neighbors is using this brand and they've had good luck for 20 years, you're probably in good shape too. So that's kind of really what this comes down to. So most of in the sorghum sedans, most of those are actually brands rather than genetics. There's a genetic name behind it somewhere, but you as a producer may not know what it is.
So 3 companies could be marketing the exact same genetics
under 3 different names, yes. Yes. So the same, in this case, we're talking hybrids. That same cross, same male and female, can be, that is a genetically defined thing. It could be in 3 different packages under 3 different brand names, 3 different companies. And that happens. Yeah.
Variety be listed on the tag on what variety it is?
Yes. Go back to this. If we know what that variety is, we have to put that on the label. The sticky part gets to be this. Most of the country, there's this term called VNS, variety not stated. Kentucky doesn't like that. For good reason. We want the producers to know what in the world this stuff is. But there's still, it's a play on words. So in Kentucky, I say variety unknown. It means the same thing. I don't think I have it on my slide. Yes, I do. Here we go. So VNS, or for us here today, variety unknown. That means either I, as a buyer, some guy says, I have some seed here. I don't know what variety it is, but here's the price, here's the specs, etc. So it's not divulged. Maybe I don't know. Or, from a practical point of view, I can tell you in our seed business, what's the number 1 killer of any distribution business? Inventory. So, I got this big mountain of Sweet Treat sorghum, just to stick with our made-up name, and it's $3 a pound, but it's killing me. I'm going to go banco if I don't get rid of this stuff. So I can say, all right, I'm going to sell it as variety unknown for $1.50 and just get rid of this stuff. Now, so I'm selling the same thing at 2 different prices. Now, if you don't know, Chris can be a little thrifty, you know, so if I convince Chris, which is hard to do, that he needs to buy this Sweet Treat at $3 a pound, and then sell Sweet Treat in that same bag and packaging to Bob for $1.50, and these 2 ever talk, that's not going to be good. So that is actually where a lot of this variety unknown stuff comes from. It's an inventory control mechanism. Most seed farmers do not plant some unknown variety. As a consumer, what does that mean? That means you may be getting the best genetics on planet Earth as variety unknown, or you may be getting the worst, and you'll never know until you plant it. So how much of a gambler are you? That's the question. So, or some variety unknown thing can be the best thing on the farm this year, and you buy the same pretty fancy bag, and it's the worst thing next year. How in the world? It's because it wasn't the same genetically sourced stuff. So that's really important to know and understand, and before I got in the industry, I had no clue. It's kind of like I've been told, everybody here eats rice cakes, right? I've been told, at least at one time, there was exactly 1 factory that made rice cakes. And they just put them in different bags as they come down the line. So similar kinds of things can happen to us in seed. This is something that Ray wanted to know, so I did some studying on this. How long can I hold over this seed? I bought some sorghum this year, weather didn't cooperate. How long can I keep it? I asked the guys in Texas, and they said, 3 to 5 years storage life, no problem. Out on the West Coast, we can keep seed like that for 2 or 3 years anyhow, no problem. In Kentucky, in a hot tobacco shed, probably not. So here's the formula. Temperature plus humidity. If that equals 100 or less, that seed will be very, very stable. 100-degree day, 90% humidity, not so stable anymore. So anytime that temperature plus humidity is over 100, we're starting to affect the lifespan of that germination. No seed lasts forever. We should be able to at least hold it over 1 year, So as an industry, there's a lot of temperature-controlled storage. We keep it at 50 degrees, 30% humidity type thing, and it lasts for a long time. But in your hot shed, that's not going to work out. Question?
Is that going to be across species?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, and some species are just better than others. A lot of our grasses or clovers, for instance, they're good keepers. But they are impacted anytime that formula is over 100, just not as quickly. So that's the magic number for seed storage.
When they banned the Roundup Ready trait and alfalfa, was all that seed that came back, was that stored and then resold later on?
Yes. And it wasn't, I can't speak for all of it, it wasn't all controlled or stored in climate control, but it was stored in an area that's pretty arid, cold in the winters, so the germination kept pretty well.
Alfalfa keeps much better.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, out west, we can keep alfalfa, if we ever wanted to, we can keep alfalfa seed 10 years. And it will be fine, because we don't have the humidity.
So when a company, say I have some carryover, I'm a local seed company, are they required to retest the germ that following year?
Oh, yeah, I should have pointed about that. Yes, that's another, America's a great country. States' rights is a big deal. Every state gets to decide how long that is. There's been a big push for a standard. Just give me one number for the whole country. Has not happened yet. How shall I say this? The shortest time span in the country is 9 months. So every 9 months we would have to retest that germination. I think that's what Kentucky is. The longest is maybe 18. So it's a range. But you've got to pretty much say every year we got to retest that germ. I'll get to you, Ray. Oh, okay. What would freezing do? Freezing keeps it. Freezing keeps it really well. So as a breeder or something, that's exactly what you do, is you put that stuff in the deep freeze and it'll outlive you. 5 minutes, Ray? Okay, we better get going here. So industry priorities, and I'll have a chance to pick some of this up in a later talk. What's happening? So our company's in Indiana. When you close your eyes and dream of a sorghum field, you're probably not picturing Indiana. You're picturing Kansas, Texas. So this stuff is moving north into places where it hasn't been grown. Farmers don't have a history and a culture of this stuff. So something like prussic acid. It's an issue, but it's way overblown. I have a good friend in Texas. He's a pretty big cattle guy, and his prussic acid test, Ray will talk to us about one here later. His is really simple. He has 1,000 cows or something. So he chooses one, and she goes out there. If she's still alive in the morning, here comes everybody else. So you pick one you don't like. That's the key. But he's never had a problem. You talk to these sorghum industry people who've been in it for 30 years, they've never seen prussic acid. A dairy farmer out by me in Washington State, which we don't use sorghum out there, but we should because of water. They're saying they don't want to touch this sorghum because they've heard of prussic acid. Number one, they're making silage. What's the risk of prussic acid in silage? Zero. There isn't one. So it's up here, this whole prussic acid thing. But anyhow, the industry is trying to move towards places where sorghum has not been, and we'll talk about that in my next talk a little bit more. This is in your handout, so I won't spend a lot of time, but the good thing about, and I'll refer to sorghums all day, and I'm talking about the whole family. Sorghum, sorghum Sudan, Sudan grass. They all kind of fit. I'll show this in another slide this afternoon, a little different way perhaps, but so 1 unit of nitrogen per growing day, or 1 1/4 if you're feeling really, really good. Another thing about sorghum that we should point out is in times of stress, drought stress for instance, sorghum rarely turns brown, but it maybe doesn't grow very much either. It just kind of sits there. It sits and waits for better weather. Water use efficiency I'll hit on. Maturity is a big one. So you have 105-day corn and 105-day sorghum, forage sorghum. They're going to be ready on the same day? No. How do we rate corn? That 105 days to what? To black layer often, to maturity. In sorghum, it's days from emergence to soft dough. to the beginning of soft dose. So totally different systems there, which again, when you're selling this stuff to corn farmers, there's a lot of explaining to do. Concept treatment, we'll talk about in a second. Maturity. So I mentioned 105 days sorghum. Most of the sorghums are 105, 110, 115. As you go north, we don't have 115 good days to grow sorghum. So that maturity range is getting shorter, as it has done in corn over the past. I think there's some 85-day stuff on the market, for instance. Okay, I'm going to run through this really fast. So variable maturity in stress. What that means is, so I have corn. I wonder if I can go back one. I have corn, BMR, corn even, and I have sorghum. So I get this hot, dry weather in July. What's that mean for corn? Not good for corn, right? You have corn this tall, but that corn is this tall. It's tasseled. It's got ears on it. It's only this tall. Good growing conditions, maybe it's 10 feet tall. So that corn is genetically programmed in 105 days, or however many heat units that represents. It's going to be done, whether it's 10 feet tall or 2 feet tall. Sorghum is not that way. Shuts down at 104 degrees. Well, it really shuts down in the field because of lack of moisture. So if it's 115 days sorghum and you got 30 days of dry weather, those days just don't count. Now you have 145-day sorghum. So it's going to wait. So different adaptations of those plants, but as a farmer, or as you're working with farmers trying to figure out when to harvest, sorghum is different. It's not going to just automatically go to maturity. It will wait out times of environmental stress, and you got to add those days to your total number. So totally different to work with. I'll talk about this later, so I won't get into it now. Not much starch, and those little, if you do let it go to maturity, those seeds of sorghum are hard little BBs that just go right on through the cow. Sugar we'll talk about later. From a nutritionist point of view, forage sorghum is almost always higher protein than corn. So if I'm having to buy supplement, don't have to buy as much protein with sorghum. Ray mentioned the BMR, and the early BMRs in sorghum and even still today in corn, they don't stand very well. Whereas the forage sorghums, especially these dwarves, really do stand. And it's because of the dense fibrous stalks. They found a way to make those stalks stand even with the BMR trait. And we don't really have all the mycotoxin concerns that you do in corn either. But now the thing that producers care about the most that didn't make my list, deer damage. Do you have any deer in Kentucky? You have a couple? Do deer eat sorghum or sorghum sudan? They don't eat it. So there are farmers who have bad deer pressure who they'll plant a cornfield, but they may plant 20 rows of sorghum all the way around it, and it really does a decent job of keeping the deer out. So why isn't sorghum widely used? There it is. We're afraid of that. We'll talk about ways to manage around that. So, I better go back to this one. Sorry. If I can. My slideshow's smarter than I am. I want to talk just a minute about, I don't know how to do it. You can see it. You guys got it in your handout. So Roundup Ready, it's a big thing in all of our crops. Is there Roundup Ready sorghum or Roundup Ready Sudan grass? Anybody buy that? Why? Two problems, and they're in your handout. Roundup Ready Johnson grass, wouldn't that be fun? So you're never going to see Roundup Ready, I don't think, in the sorghum family just because of outcrossing, shatter cane and sorghum. Now, what we can do to help with weed control, there's something called Concept. It's a seed treatment, and that allows you, if that seed is treated, that allows you to put on pre-emerge herbicide, dual. And then you can put on your pre-emerge, controls most of your weeds, and your sorghum seeds will grow through it because of that treatment. The only fly in the ointment there is we have had issues where if you get a lot of rain, it will wash off that Concept treatment and you can get some damage. Something coming in the future, there is going to be, it's in your handout there, at least one company is working with DuPont to make an herbicide tolerant. Not a GMO, by the way. It's tolerant of the ALS herbicides, and that was found naturally in shattercane, of all things. So shattercane's good for something. We found that trait. We'll move that in. That will give you then some post-emerge weed control, but you're never going to see the Roundup Ready. And I think I'll probably stop there. Sorry I didn't get to some of the traits. Maybe we can bring those out in a later talk, Ray. They're in the handout.
We can grab varieties.
Yeah, good.
How many more slides do you have? I think I have an hour. Am I next?
You next. Organic varieties?
Organic varieties was a question. Okay, thanks, Chris. And sorry I messed my time up. Organic varieties. There are, from different sources, you can get organic Sudan grass, you can get organic sorghum Sudan, and you can get organic forage sorghum from different places. Availability is limited because production acres down in Texas are limited, but that is becoming more available. Other question?
Since it is a warm season, how much cold tolerance will it tolerate in the fall and still keep growing?
It usually, the question was how much cold tolerance does this material have, and will it keep growing? It will stay green, I'll put it this way, pretty much until a frost, but 60-degree nights or cooler, it's not growing very much anymore. So a management technique that we use in the north, we may let this stuff go until it frosts and use that to dry it down to then harvest it. So it'll pretty much stay green until a frost, but 60-degree nights are not good for sorghum. Yeah, the question is what absolutely kills it, and I don't know that. 3 nights in the teens for sure would. Maybe 3 nights of frost in general. But I don't know. Anyone know really where that line is? In the back?
It's got to be at least 26 hours below 30 degrees.
Okay, 26 hours below 30 degrees. Thank you. Okay, so some of these traits, photoperiod sensitive, and again, I'm going to think of these in light of why aren't we using more of these sorghum crops, and what could we do to change that? The maturity we just talked about, that's an issue. So plants can be short day, long day, day neutral. Most of our sorghums, they are triggered by the days getting shorter, I believe. So with these photoperiod sensitive ones, they will not initiate heading until daylight is less than 12 and a half hours. So depending on where you live, that's going to be September sometime probably. So you got all growing season where the stuff's not going to shoot ahead. That can have implications for something like grass-fed beef, or if you just don't want to deal with those heads, you can manage around that. Now, when it comes to dry down, how is this stuff going to dry down? It's not until the end of the season, because it's still growing green leaves all season long. So if you're mechanically harvesting this stuff, you're going to have to rake and that kind of stuff more than likely. Because it's adding new leaves. Its forage quality is great, but that stuff is going to be green as a gourd all season long. The way the companies, and by the way, in my talks, I tried to use material from a bunch of different companies just to give you guys various perspectives. This one is something we don't think about often, but if you don't have a chopper and you're relying on the custom guy, you can wait a week or two or time it when he's not doing corn, and you'll still have good quality stuff if you use photoperiod sensitive. And it's available in most of ours. Male sterile's another one.
Yeah, a lot of guys will use that photoperiod sensitive, that last cutting, and use it for winter grazing too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the comment was a lot of folks with the photoperiod sensitive, they'll use that last cutting perhaps for grazing, just let it go as long as it will. So male sterile then, if you look at these in the field, and we're not late enough in the year to see it, I don't think, they will actually have what kind of looks like a seed head sometimes, but there's nothing in it, unless there's outside pollen. So if the neighbor across the road has a conventional variety, you're going to have some seed. This is the stuff that gets used a lot in grass-fed beef production because there's no grain. It's just really, really high quality grass. So if you think about what happens when plants go to maturity, all those sugars from the stem get turned into starch in the kernels. We don't have that process here. So it really can be really, really high quality stuff. Here's probably the one that's made the most difference in the field, brachytic dwarf, and it is a genetic thing. I think there's 3 or 4 height genes. It's not really that much different of a concept than 50 years ago. You know, all the Angus cows in the country were this tall. Same kind of deal. We're not short on leaves. If you count there, I think there's 14 leaves on that plant. But what it is just shortens the internode distance. So instead of a foot between the nodes, there's a couple inches. So you have that little bitty plant like that, and you're not losing as much tonnage as you think either. It really is amazing. And lodging is not an issue at all. So that's been a really, really good trait to get those producers who are afraid of sorghum because they're afraid of lodging. This gets us around that issue. If that was the only thing stopping adoption, we can help those guys. Say that again? Is the light uptake? Good. Is light uptake the same? It is probably mostly because of row spacing. A lot of our, especially the true sorghums, are on 30-inch rows like corn. So in there it is. That's a really good question, though. From everything we know, it is. It is. Yeah, that's a good question. So you'd think those leaves on the bottom, it's actually surprising they're still green, that any light gets down there. Really good question. So you guys have the words in your handouts. But I think now, this slide's a little bit old, you can get dwarfs in sorghum, sorghum Sudan hybrids, and actually Sudan grass as well. Brown midrib, Ray talked about, so we won't waste any time on that one. Dry stock, here's another one. A lot of these sorghum Sudans especially, guys are making haylage or something out of them. Some guys try to make dry hay even, which is really, really difficult. But with this dry stock trait, 64 to 69% moisture, that's silage moisture. And it will do it still standing up. So you can direct harvest some of this stuff. Something I did not know until I started working on this talk, this dry stock thing does not kick in until boot stage. So if you got plants this tall, they're going to be the same moisture with or without the dry stock trait. Once you start getting into boot, those plants will be drier.
It's important to point out too, the dry stock doesn't mean dry hay.
Yeah, that's right. The comment was dry stock does not mean dry hay. Still, if you're talking sorghum Sudan with the stalk that big around, you're not going to get that thing dried down for hay. You're just able to harvest silage a little more easily.
How prevalent is this trait in the market?
This dry stock, I think, of all of these that we've talked about, dry stock is the newest one. And you guys help me out. It's available in, I think it's available in all. It's available in sorghum, sorghum Sudan, and Sudan grass, I believe. But not very many varieties of each. Yeah, so it is a limited thing. And I think, thanks for the extra time, Chris. I hope you don't end up short. Any questions? Yes?
Do they have any trait stack varieties?
Any trait stack varieties of, yes. So you can get like a brachytic dwarf, for instance, that's also BMR, that's also dry stock. Yeah, they are starting to do that, yes. And so that's going to vary by company quite heavily. Good question.